on the Minerals and Energy Resource Financial Provisioning Bill 2018. This bill was originally tabled back in October 2008 and 17 in the 55th Parliament prior to the last election, which obviously lapsed, and this new bill was introduced into the 56th Parliament back in February. The 2017 bill was considered by the Parliamentary Committee but was never debated in Parliament. This new similar bill was introduced into the 56th Parliament back in February, as I said, and was referred to the Economics and Governance Committee. This being the last bill for our committee that we'll be debating this year, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the members of the committee. I'd like to acknowledge our chair, the member for Logan, our esteemed deputy chair, the honourable member for Mermaid Beach, along with the members for Pine Rivers and Redlands. I'd also like to acknowledge the very honourable member for Bonnie, Mr Deputy Speaker, and although he doesn't look that honourable at the moment with his mo, I can say back when we debated this bill, he did look honourable, and I hope he's making some money for prostate cancer for November, because he's not making any friends at the moment. So,
point of order, Mr Deputy Speaker.
What's your point of order, member for Bonnie?
I take personal offence and I ask the member to withdraw.
Member, order. Member for Nindri, you've been asked to withdraw.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
Thank you. Let's get back to the bill, member for Nindri.
It is an important issue. And more seriously, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to genuinely acknowledge the work of the Secretariat. We all know the hard work that they do, not just on this bill, but the support they've given us for all the bills we've considered and the reports we've drafted and tabled this year. So I sincerely like to thank the Secretariat. In relation to this bill, our committee received a considerable number of written submissions, about 50, and we heard from a number of stakeholders during the public briefing and public hearings. I think it's a shame that this bill has been before the Parliament, or the 55th Parliament, for over a year, and we're only now in the last few hours been given 40 pages of amendments that the committee nor I have had the appropriate time to scrutinise. As I said, this is an important issue, and there is no one in this state wants to see an abandoned mine that has not been rehabilitated to an acceptable standard. As we've heard others outline earlier in this debate, the policy objectives of this bill are to manage the financial risk to the state if mineral and energy resource tenure holders do not comply with their environmental management and rehabilitation obligations, and to ensure land disturbed by mining activities is rehabilitated to a safe and stable landform that does not cause environmental harm and can sustain an approved post-mining land use. The bill proposes to implement these reforms by establishing a new financial provisioning scheme and implementing mining rehabilitation reforms. The catalyst for this bill is that, unfortunately, a number of cases have emerged where operators were unable to meet their rehabilitation obligations, and concerns had also been raised about the quality of rehabilitation work undertaken. As a result, the Queensland Treasury Corporation undertook a review into current financial assurance arrangements. The explanatory notes state that the proposed new scheme does not change the environmental or rehabilitation obligations, but is designed to protect the state's financial interests. The explanatory notes also state that the new financial provisioning scheme seeks to substantially be self-funded. This scheme fund sets out the requirements for how the fund accounts are to be kept, how amounts must be deposited, and how the scheme is to be managed. An important point is that payments made to the fund are controlled receipts and are not part of the consolidated revenue. An amount is payable for the fund only for the purpose of the Act, or to repay an amount advanced to the fund by the Treasurer. But there are some alarming components of this bill. The first one is the lack of transparency. During the committee process, the Office of the Information Commissioner raised concerns about changing the RTI Act to exempt documents communication to the scheme manager. I do understand, with sidebar conversation with the chair of the committee, that the 40 pages of amendments I haven't had a chance to scrutinise in detail yet do address some of these issues, Mr Speaker. Unsurprisingly, though, there are a number of submissions received by the committee raising concerns about these lack of transparency issues, as this government talks the talk about transparency but certainly doesn't walk the walk. Mr Deputy Speaker, there is an important issue. This is an important issue, not only in terms of having a viable resource sector, but to ensure that our natural environment is protected and maintained for future generations to come. As at April 2017, Australia had 220,000 hectares of land that were under resource exploration and with an estimated rehabilitation cost of $8.7 billion. In 2016 and 17, our minerals and energy sector contributed over $25 billion to the Queensland economy. With a total supported workforce of almost 51,000 full-time employee positions and around 300,000 total jobs linked directly to the mining industry in Queensland. That also included $4 billion paid to the state government, whether it be by royalties, stamp duty, payroll tax or land tax. Mr Deputy Speaker, although I think everyone supports a regime or legislation that supports a viable and sustainable resource sector that ensures our natural environment is protected, there are major concerns around this bill from a number of key stakeholders, even stakeholders who don't always see eye to eye. The CFMEU, in conjunction with the Queensland Resource Council, sent all members of the Economics and Governance Committee a copy of a letter addressed to the Premier on Friday, raising their joint concerns about the bill in its then current form. They believe that the bill, as it was drafted, could jeopardise the 300,000 Queensland jobs that are directly tied to the mining industry in this state. As I mentioned earlier, this bill was originally tabled in the previous parliament, and I understand new amendments were frantically being drafted over the past few days, only after the intervention and to appease the CFMEU, and it's disappointing the committee hasn't had a good chance to research and deliberate these amendments. An article in the Australian newspaper on Monday, written off the back of an independent audit conducted by Ernst Young, reported that 16 Queensland mines may be forced to shut and more than 2,500 jobs may be lost under this rehabilitation plan proposed by the Treasurer that could lead to a $1 billion hit to the state's commodity producers. The Australian goes on to say some of the world's largest resource companies, including BHP, Anglo America, Peabody Energy and Glencore, are reeling from amendments to the Mining and Energy Resource Bill that threaten to impose crippling financial imposts on existing mines. 16 mines are at high risk of net asset deficiencies, which indicates potential insolvency. If the mines owned by those companies close, the sector could lose 2,500 jobs, representing $306 million in wages and $2.2 billion in economic output. As I said earlier, Mr Deputy Speaker, I appreciate 40 pages of amendments were circulated through the chamber at about 11 o'clock this morning, and some of these issues, I understand, might be addressed in those amendments. And again, it was disappointing that we haven't had a chance to scrutinise them at this stage. Mr Speaker, just in closing, we need to balance the need for a thriving mining sector with protecting our environment, and we need to make sure these bills and the amendments do that. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nindri. I call the member for Gladstone.
Thank you, Speaker.